Well, today I'm out surveying what pruning jobs I'm going to need to be tackling in the future. Not necessarily right now because it's a little bit premature, but in the future. I thought it might be helpful even for those of you that are still under 5 feet of snow or however many feet where you are. First of all, I really am holding you in my thoughts and prayers because I can't imagine how that must be. We Southerners sometimes take for granted our mild winters, so we're very appreciative of that. In my part of the country, in Zone 7B right now, we're kind of on a roller coaster ride where temps are one day very, very cold, the next day they're very, very warm. So you want to be mindful of that for any kind of gardening chores you do going forward. But today I thought it might be helpful if I kind of walked my border to talk about some of the things that I can safely kind of prune right now, but most of which I'm going to hold off to prune after bloom or when it's safe to bloom. So let me just kind of begin because it all depends on what the plant is. Right now, a lot of you have damage to your boxwood and you're wondering if you can start pruning them yet, if you can prune out, like errant branches like this that are sticking out of profile. But other than cutting out dead wood, you really want to leave them alone, particularly in zones like mine where it's warm one day, it's cold the next. A warm day might signal that they need to flush out with new growth, and then that can get hard bit by an Arctic blast the next week. So right now, for the most part, just leave your boxwood alone. Wait to prune them until very late winter, early spring, just before they put out a new flush of growth. Now, this stand here, this is probably the question I get asked most of all, is what about my hydrangeas? Most of these hydrangeas here bloom on old wood. So if I want them to bloom this spring, I'm definitely not going to prune them now, because even though these look like they might be dead, tired canes, if you look closely, you can see that there are green buds projecting out from what looks to be a dead cane. Now, this makes me both happy and sad. It tells me that these are all still alive and they have a potential to bloom in the early summer. But it also scares me a little bit because some of them, let me see if I can find a bud that is really kind of farther along. Here's one. Stuart, look here. See, that one is already turning green. If we get a hard blast, like we're going to get next week, there's a potential that any blooms for this year might get frost bit and cold bit and not bloom in early summer. If your hydrangeas are not blooming, that very well could be the reason why, because they bloom on old wood, and that old wood suffered from a severe late freeze. So I'm going to kind of just leave these guys alone. I'm not going to touch them. I have here, that I know just from experience, is an Annabelle hydrangea that blooms on new wood. I'm going to prune it back a little bit, but again, it's premature to do that. So I'm not going to do any of that. I'm going to leave it alone. Going further to the north, I've got a large expanse here of oak leaf hydrangeas. Now, oak leaf hydrangeas, a number of you asked me about this a couple of weeks ago. These, you don't want to do any pruning on them really at all. I never prune these guys unless there's a broken or a damaged stem or branch. I pretty much just leave them alone. They just bloom reliably every single year. I don't have to worry about them with a hard freeze. I just pretty much leave them alone. I'm gonna leave my viburnum alone. You can't really tell what it is at this point. This will put out glossy green foliage in the spring. I'm gonna leave it alone. And if I do any pruning on it, it will be more for structural reasons and how I like to limb things up, architectural reasons. It won't necessarily be because of how it affects bloom. Now, this stand here despite the fact that it looks really ugly right now. It is going to look spectacular this spring. This is a large stand of Deutzia that puts out little tiny white flowers and tight white buds in the spring. If I pruned it back now, I would prune off all of those sweet, dainty, romantic little blooms. So I'm not going to touch it. This is one of those spring flowering shrubs. Prune after bloom, just like azaleas and forsythia and any other spring bloomers. I'll leave it alone, and then I might come in and prune it very, very hard after it finishes blooming. But right now I'm gonna leave it alone. I'm also going to leave it alone because this is a wonderful little habitat for birds and wildlife, and they like sometimes to nest in here. So I'm definitely just going to leave this alone. And even though it's kind of brown, look how pretty even those brown canes look against the spent, aged, silvery flower heads of the oak leaf hydrangea. I really like that. Even that I find beautiful. So moving on down, I've got more boxwood that I'm going to leave alone. This is a barberry. This is an orange rocket barberry, and I've got some golden barberry in here as well. I'm going to leave these alone right now, and then in about, I would say 2 or 3 weeks, I'm probably going to give these a pretty hard prune, but I'm going to wait again because I don't want them to put out any new growth that could suffer from a hard freeze. But I'm going to leave these alone until then, and I might prune it back by as much as half. The thing about barberries is you can prune them pretty hard to manage their growth. And when you do that, you're not only managing their growth and their size, but it forces out new growth that isn't nearly so woody and nearly so prickly. So that's something I'm also going to wait on. Now, I don't see any here immediately at hand, but if there were dead branches, broken branches on any of this, as there was after the ice storm, then I could easily come in here. I could prune out any dead wood. As a matter of course, anytime you have any dead wood on any kind of shrub or tree, then definitely go ahead and prune it out no matter what the season is, because you want to make sure you have a clean cut and you don't have an open wound that could be a vector for disease or for insects or anything along those lines. So any time of year, if you have dead or diseased wood, you definitely can pretty much safely prune that out. This woodgelia, I'm just going to leave it alone. It's going to bloom in late spring, early summer. Now, I'm not doing anything with these Nandina right now, but I'm going to in the future, and I could if I wanted to, but I'm going to do a whole separate video on pruning Nandina, when, why, and how. So I will reserve that for a separate video. I'm going to talk a little bit about this gorgeous viburnum, this Chinese snowball viburnum that is probably the most commented on plant in my entire landscape. In the spring, it's simply spectacular. And I don't know, Stuart, if you can get up close and you can see that it's already setting bud. And these tiny little buds are the things that are going to turn into large white hydrangea-like flowers in the spring. And it will be simply magnificent. Obviously, those buds that are going to bloom in the spring, I am not going to prune those off. I'm just going to leave those alone. And then I'm going to, if we'll come back around over here, my sunshine ligustrum, again, I'm going to leave it alone. I'm not going to prune it until just before it's ready to put out its first flush of growth in the spring. Roses are difficult, I think, in terms of when to prune, because ostensibly you can prune them in winter when they go dormant. But in my 7B garden, they never truly go dormant. And so if I pruned them right now, I could force new growth that could then get sapped by a freeze next week, or in the coming weeks rather. So I'm just gonna pretty much leave them alone. if any of them are really in the way, or there's dead wood or something like that, diseased wood, I could go ahead and prune that out. But for the most part, I'm going to leave these alone because these two are going to bloom in the spring, and this also I will prune after bloom. My evergreens, I sometimes give a little bit of a prune to. This is a blue point juniper. This is a distilium, and I might prune them a little bit in the wintertime if I want to use their greenery, but I do that normally around the holidays. Other than that, for the most part, my hollies, all of them, I'm just going to leave them all alone until the spring, late winter, early spring, when I can get them into shape, because I don't want them to force a lot of new pruning. If you haven't guessed it by now, pruning encourages a flush of new growth. And so I don't want any of that new growth to come out prematurely and get zapped, perhaps by the Arctic blast that's coming next week. And I know you guys laugh at Stuart and I when we talk about, oh, it's kind of cold out today, and it'll be in the upper 40s or the lower 50s. Well, we in the South are just kind of wusses when it comes to the cold. So those of you up in Canada in much colder climes, feel free to make fun of us because it's all relative, I guess. But we have that summer heat to contend with that you guys don't. So I guess it all washes out in the end. So there's just a few kind of pruning tips. If you can't get out there and prune that much, what you can do is make sure that all of your pruners are oiled, sharpened, and ready to go for when it's time to get snipping. You guys have a great weekend.